Welcome to another episode of the Ecom Ops podcast. Dayu and myself are here to take you on a journey on how shipping from China actually works. What are the shipping lines behind and how can you leverage them? Give you a behind the scene almost on how shipping lines from China work. Hope you like the episode. Stay tuned because we're going to go right into the details. All right, Dayu, another episode here on how China shipping lines actually work. That will be an interesting one because we both have been in the industry for a long time and we've seen the industry evolve. So let's just start with what actually the options out there. What options do you have?
Yeah, sure, Simon. And I want to also be specific that today we're talking about small parcel shipping directly to customers around the world, not necessarily ocean freight or bulk freight in general. So we're talking about parcel shipping from China to around the world. There are a lot of options, and there are ever more options increasing today, especially more recently. So right now it's 2024. More recently, there's been a really boom in both the usage and also interest in parcel fulfillment from China when you see the growth of companies like Shein or Temu, and then there's always AliExpress and drop shipping from AliExpress. So through the last 5 to 10 years, there has been a lot of evolution of shipping line options. Now, I would say that really goes the whole range between cheap and not efficient and probably not recommended to expensive and probably too expensive and not recommended as well. Actually, the cheapest what we even think you should consider is China Post. China Post is basically China's version of a local postal service. It usually has some tracking. It's relatively slow and inefficient. So that's the cheapest option that we would ever recommend anyone to use. There are even cheaper options. There are untracked options. There are options that actually just put parcels on sea freight and kind of disappears for a while and then the parcels show up somewhere. But those are the ones that take 1 month, 2 months, if they even get there in the first place, and very poor or non-existent tracking. Some of the more, I would say, known options, like I imagine everyone in e-commerce is going to know of DHL Express, or like FedEx or UPS. And these are very traditional international shipping line options. They're actually better for freight, actually, but a lot of people use them for small parcels as well. They're quite a bit more expensive for what they are. They are really not that much faster depending on how you use it. And they actually have a lot of fundamental issues. For example, they typically have much more stringent regulations around like customs declarations. Even if you pay your VAT or taxes legitimately, they don't always have an easy mechanism for it to fast track through customs and get to your customers without getting stuck, without making your customers then pay for some other duties. It's just by nature of their line. They're probably more suited for if you are sending a sample, for example, or sending a package to your grandma, and they know to receive it and possibly have to pay duty. And then there is what we strongly recommend, and we'll go into more detail later. And it's companies like Uniexpress or 4PX or UBI, if you've heard any of those. And that's a fundamentally different model of operating small parcel shipments to across the world, really. And it's much more efficient, cost efficient, and fast enough. And it has good tracking. It has great reliability and great transparency in how it moves down the line.
Yeah, maybe another way to describe the differences is China Post is actually C2C, consumer to consumer. I remember very clearly in China Post head office in Beijing, there were 8 people sitting in front of me, a long table. There were 8 officers from China Post sitting in front of me, and was me with someone else. I was like, okay, and then we're gonna have a meeting. And then we had this our session, and the next batch came, another 8 came in about another topic. I was like, wow, this is intense. They always emphasize China Post channel is a consumer to consumer channel and has been misused for B2C purposes. So companies that have been using it to ship to the consumer, it's postal companies are set up to distribute initially letters or cards from one individual to another individual. It hasn't been set up to have a big range of B2C parcels being shipped in a timely manner and efficient manner itself. This model never existed. And then the express companies, they are much more a B2B driven companies. Even if it's an individual parcel, it tends to be a sample, but it's from one company to another company. That is a very different operating mode than to a consumer, because then for consumer, tax is a burden. For a company, that's part of running a business, that you have to pay taxes at some point when there's an importation or when there's a sales. The model that we actually are really encouraging is the B2C model. And that B2C model has been created in the past 10 years and evolved into what it is today, and it's going to continue to evolve. So that's a very important distinction, the C2C, the B2C, and the B2B. So we're not going to talk about the B2B logistics. We're not going to talk about the C2C logistics. We're going to talk about the B2C logistics today. When we're focused on that, so what will be your recommendation on that part for a D2C brand shipping from China in a B2C way? What will be your recommendation?
Yeah, so definitely. So the top company out there currently is Uniexpress, although we generally do evaluate various couriers. 4PX is a good one, UBI is a good one. There's new couriers that we are always aware of and testing. And they're not just brands for a similar type of courier line, actually. They fundamentally work extremely differently. The reason, and we'll talk a little bit more about the nuances of how they actually work. But the reason why we strongly recommend them is the customer experience. So when you're talking about China Post, or maybe many of you listening to this have heard of e-packet before. E-packet is another name for that China Post to local post process. And again, that was made for mail. And people just figured out, hey, like the size limits for mail are still enough to send most smaller consumer products. But mail has no reason to be so super efficient, right? And that's just not the model that they deal with, right? But Uniexpress and similar, they grew with the huge growth of cross-border e-commerce from China to around the world, whether that is Chinese sellers or like AliExpress, for example, or Western sellers who are utilizing a China fulfillment center like Ecomops, for example, and accessing the ability to ship their products directly from China. It's a very different model. You might be thinking, okay, well, what is that different than like C2C versus B2C versus B2B? It really has to do with the frequency of the packages, especially the same type of package or same product. Very rarely are you going to be sending your family members like more than a couple of packages at a time. And similarly to a B2B line, right? However, some of our clients, they send thousands of orders per day to their customers around the world. That's per day of one product. That's the scale that we're talking about. We peaked as a client who actually sold and we fulfilled 60,000 orders within a couple of days. So that's the volume that we're talking about. And that is a completely different type of volume and volume spikes and complexity to manage that consistent delivery compared to more usually the one-off type of packages that you normally see sending through postal services, or or sending something as a sample to your to an influencer, for example, using something like DHL Express. And along the ways, they have just highly optimized with the understanding that their own clients also care about their customers, which means English end-to-end tracking, focus on consistency. Actually, during some of the, even COVID days, but just generally during supply chain disruptions, they took efforts to vastly increase their investments, reserving planes, reserving air freight capacity, sometimes increasing prices because of it, unfortunately, but because they realize that it is important for their own clients, the businesses that work with them, to get the hundreds, thousands of orders per day to their customers within a reasonable timeline that is, not longer than a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and the data component is important as well, because the description of the product, what's inside, is on the label. So it's a manual process. There is no data being transferred from one postal company to another postal company, because these are consumer goods. It's also privacy sensitive. You don't have to disclose everything that's being shipped from one place to another. But it's been misused both ways, from China to the rest of the world, but also from the rest of the world to China. There was a lot of milk powder being shipped by postal companies to China. And also that was streamlined by having actually companies being set in between to optimize this whole flow from one side to another. With the data, you can create more transparency, more clearance, better clearance as well, which then speeds up the process, because that's definitely a component of a postal clearance clearance, commercial clearance. These are two very different outliers on how efficient they are operating versus what's currently using is more a commercial clearance line for B2C shipments leaving China. I think that's a very important part as well.
Now, Simon, I was actually going to segue into actually describing the difference between Uniexpress or something like that service versus more of a C2C or B2B model. But maybe actually what I was going to explain probably has a lot of similarities with some of your experiences before managing traditional freight. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about how that process worked?
Yeah, we separated this C2C and B2C and a B2B, and I think I touched upon the difference of C2C mainly being a manual process, but also when you have the spike. C2C, the postal companies, they have actually lot agreements on how much space they get at discounted rates in planes. And once their lot is full, it goes on the next flight. There's no incentive to go very fast. Besides that, China Post, according to the World Health Organization, is still considered an underdeveloped country, and therefore it has subsidized rates for global distribution by post. I think that is slowly being phased out because China the middle class is improving. But it also means that last mile postal companies don't want to invest a lot in servicing small parcels from China to help them facilitate that process, because it's going to cost them more than they get back from it from China Post itself. So there is a financial component, there's a data component regarding the C2C not being the optimal. When it comes to B2B, let's say you have a small parcel that's being shipped by DHL, or let's say, let's take DHL as an example. You have that being picked up in your warehouse or your office, then it's being brought to their hub, and from that hub it's being brought to an airport. Most likely the airport, when it comes from China, it will be going to Hong Kong. That's the main hub to ship out of China. So there will be a truck from Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, there will be an uplift. And DHL is operating a lot of their freights also by themselves. They have more planes for themselves, or they leverage existing line hauls. And then they will ship it to their facilities, because each main hub also has a DHL warehouse where they receive the parcel, they will arrange the custom clearance, and then they will hand it over to their own last mile or partner last mile, but most of the time it's also DHL then doing the last mile delivery. That's kind of the concept of them managing the full supply chain, and also heavy on assets. The B2C model that we're talking about right now is a light asset model, meaning is you have the pickup facility to go to the office or warehouse in China to collect the parcels, bring it to your own warehouse in China, and from that warehouse you actually have booked air freight with other people's planes, capacity, you just booked capacity. These flights, they go and land, you push the data to the custom clearance operator, they clear it, and then you inject it into the last mile. You're not operating each step of the way yourself. You actually have a supply chain that's partially outsourced. Only the beginning part is done by you, and the rest of it is much more outsourced. And obviously, there are more and more companies evolving into having their overseas warehouse as well as part of it. And what I'm always curious about is, at what point is a Chinese logistic company going to buy a share of a last mile, let's say a postal company? Most postal companies, at least in Europe, are government owned or partially government owned, but not all of them. Some also have a stock listing. So that means that technically they could be looking for a postal or last mile company that will be able to help them do the last mile under their own flag, so to say. But again, this light asset model has brought them so far ahead of the game that it just makes sense for them actually to continue with this model and see how they can leverage even further and maybe even speed up, because you have different stakeholders in between. The win in time towards these 72 hours that I mentioned in the last episode is to manage the data flow from stakeholder to other stakeholder, and not waiting for actually the goods, the volume to arrive in your warehouse, and then you start doing the custom clearance, but already doing it when the plane is still in the air, and just making sure that everything is very fully transparent, so you can just speed up everything from A to Z, to the last touch point.
There's a lot of similarities in how something like Uniexpress actually works with that more traditional model. One thing that you mentioned is the asset light model. I think I do want to emphasize that, maybe if you think about from a business perspective, it is probably good for someone like Uniexpress to be asset light. However, that's actually good for really everyone who uses them as well, because being asset light also means more flexibility. and more agility in how they can operate as well. In a similar vein to just holding less inventory and being able to adapt faster to market changes. A very tangible example was back in the very, very peak days of COVID supply chain delays, where not only were containers stuck in the water for months at a time, everyone was trying to get either parcels or B2B orders on air out of China. What happened was that DHL, which is usually a little bit faster, much more expensive though, DHL became backlogged. And DHL actually became slower than the Uniexpress faster lines because DHL relied on their own planes and their own capacity. They didn't have a mechanism to actually be able to expand that capacity as fast as needed, right? It's hard to just get a new plane, right? So what happened was that the couriers like Uniexpress, they were bidding on market rates for air freight. It got more expensive because of it. However, they were able to reasonably maintain a similar level of service, whereas DHL, things were backlogged 3, 4, 5 days sometimes at a time because they were waiting in line to get on a plane, regardless of how much DHL actually cared about their clients and customer service. There was literally no physical capacity to go around. And it probably didn't make business sense for DHL to invest in a ton of new planes that they probably predicted, rightfully so, was not going to be utilized at the same level post-COVID. So that's an example where actually having more of an asset light model and a logistic chain has a lot of benefits. And that's a example of where having more flexibility along the chain has a lot of benefits, even though this sometimes means that there are going to be market rate adjustments, naturally speaking. But the model that you're talking about, I mean, let me actually talk about kind of like the step-by-step of what actually happens when a client of ours, one of their customers, issues an order, and then how does it get to the customer? So you actually understand the nuances of how it works. Our warehouse, e-com ops, is based in Shenzhen, which is a location where we strongly recommend your warehouses for fulfillment to be based because of proximity to Hong Kong and the fastest courier lines there is. We typically integrate with our clients either through Shopify or direct API integrations. We integrate sometimes through ShipStation and other platforms as well. And an order comes to us very similar to you using any other 3PL. We examine the order, we pack it usually within the business day if there's no issues. And then we have our Uniexpress or whatever courier that we utilize for different countries, they come pick up from our warehouse at least once a day during peak seasons, multiple times a day. During the peakest seasons, midnight and past midnight sometimes in order to get orders out. They send it to their routing warehouse that is also based, it's not exactly in Shenzhen City, but very close by. They combine and process all of the client orders. So it's not just us, we are one of their top 10 clients. However, they do combine other orders as well. And they use a very efficient process of then getting those on the right freight lines to across the world. And it depends on where you're actually going. So for example, the United States, there are 3 major airports that they can fly through. In Europe, there's a couple countries they fly through. Let's use UK as an example. UK is actually one of the most efficient lines that we have. So we've seen times where it takes as fast as 2.5 days to go from our warehouse directly to a customer in the UK. And now, we've had people ask, that seems impossible. Like, how is that possible, right? Well, if you actually think about it, right? We get a pickup from our warehouse. It goes straight to their routing warehouse. Next day, it's on the way to Hong Kong. If it gets lucky, it gets on a flight from Hong Kong to the UK almost right away, and that gets there in half a day. If the customer is living in London and there's no issues or delays with customs processing, that could get to that customer within the next day as well. Obviously, time zone differences helps a little bit there too as well. So let's say 2.5 days, maybe 3 days, if you consider the time zones, like the total end-to-end process. Now that's fast. I would say, the only faster you're going to get is literally if you're fulfilling from a UK warehouse. That being said, that's a very rare occurrence. Maybe it's 1 out of 200 times or so. So we're not going to say that is actually going to be an expectation. However, I'm using that example to show you that there's no physical reason why it can be fast. Other countries are a little bit slower, but typically it's because customs processing takes a little bit more time. Or the United States is larger, so it's larger distances for last mile, or Australia is a good example of that as well. However, it's incredibly efficient. There's probably parts that can be compressed, and Simon has continued to believe that we can, hopefully couriers can compress that to maybe 3 days, 4 days, 3 or 5 days on average around the world. It hasn't happened yet. There's opportunity to do so. However, it's an indication that it is incredibly efficient. So you're not getting 3 days all the time to the UK, but if you're not getting 4 to 6 days on average, from your fulfillment center to customers in the UK using something like Uniexpress, you're either not using the right lines or there's something up with your processing as well. So maybe there's some inefficiencies with the warehousing or 3PL processing. However, if you do everything right, it works. And the reason why we really like using this process is because it follows that kind of B2B model. The other thing that's notable mention is that typically it directly injects into a local courier line. So unlike DHL Express, for example, it's not necessarily managed, the last mile is usually different than the first mile. However, these days that has been extremely efficient, and it's really not that much of a difference than if you have your local warehouse in the US, for example, you receive a bunch of parcels, or actually even just a container or a pallet, and then you immediately then send that off into the USPS system, depending on how fast you can do that. Now, if you're depalletizing something or getting stuff out of a container and then processing that into orders, that's not going to take, it's going to take days, right? That's not efficient, right? But direct injection, this is the key. Because the parcels are already previously packed by your fulfillment center or by us, customs clearing is done on the way, the labeling is done on the way. So literally, it's just directly injected into the local USPS or whatever local last mile system. So there's very little inefficiency there. And that's why you can get very, very fast and efficient routing and shipping processes.
Yeah, so these injections into the last mile needs to be done in postal bags, and that's also the way postal bags has always been going around into the last mile network. So as long as it's being delivered in postal bags, then it's always important that it's also going to be efficient. So the last mile, they have certain requirements on how to receive the parcels. So there's going to be one bag, and inside there are 30 to 40 parcels, obviously depending on the size of the parcels. But the interesting part itself is it could be that as 1 to 3 times a day, Uniexpress, for example, comes to pick up in our warehouse. That's during the daytime, most of the time, or end of the day. Then they have a night process where all these parcels are then thrown onto a conveyor belt. So this is not a conveyor belt that's a small size when you go in an escalator or when you just go into the airport. This is the size of a football court. And this just goes all around one big warehouse. And all these bags that are being picked up from our warehouse are then thrown into this conveyor belt that spins around, where each parcel is then being put there and being pictured. Pictures being taken, is being weighted. And this is not, okay, wait for a second. This is just instantly weighed. In a second, they can weigh and take a picture and register the barcode, and then it moves on. And based on that registration, they can determine in which postal bag it has to fall into. So at the end of this conveyor belt that keeps going round and round and round, there are shafts at the end where they just flip the parcel into one postal bag that it belongs to, and then another postal bag if it's for that last mile, let's say Royal Mail 48 hours or Royal Mail 24 hours, or maybe some other last mile or any last mile there. That's kind of like the optimization where they can do thousands of parcels being sorted in an hour. I think even 50,000 in an hour. It goes really fast, and I've seen it happening where there's just operators changing the postal bags. Once it get full, they have to move it away, put another one there to be able to make it run smoothly. And whenever there are parcels that are not being registered, they have to then being sorted aside, that they just manually have to throw into this bag. But the efficiency is so high that you can have already the shipment ready. So there's pre-alerted to us. When they come to pick up, they know how much they're picking up. They can already book the flights. They just have the night process to actually get the sortation done to the last injection point. And that is clear which on the bag already where it needs to go to. Is this Royal Mail 24 hours, Royal Mail 48 hours? Is this another last mile? In this way, on postal bag, they can really sort that quickly. That part, that night process has been crucial to be able to get us close to this 2.5 days that Dayu mentioned. But obviously, that's not the norm. Hopefully, it will be. That has helped a lot tremendously.
Don't get me wrong, it's very rarely 2.5 days. And we've certainly heard about examples or other companies saying that you can use China fulfillment, parcel shipping, averaging less than 6 days around the world. That's also not exactly true. I mean, it might average 6 days, but usually what we would say that for the UK is a little bit faster. The UK, like if you're using the express line, usually you're looking at 4 to 6 days, sometimes 2.5 days, but usually we say 4 to 6 days. The regular lines there may be more like 4 to 8 days or 5 to 8 days or so. And then the US, I think you're not getting every time under 6 days, no matter what line you're using in the US. That's just not possible. Average, yes. So normally we say maybe it's 7 to 10 days. So I guess that's the average of. Well, I mean, it's still above 6 days for the more economic line. There is an express line that's still reasonable that we're looking at maybe 5 to 8 days, 5 to 7 days. So maybe that's where this average 6 days come from. But again, it's like we will only be comfortable saying maybe it's an average of 6 days for the express line for the US at least. Definitely not like all packages or even most packages arriving under that time frame. And you certainly want to be careful about like making sure that whoever you work with, you actually ask for a reasonable range of the shipping lines and not just some average date. I mean, even if you're using local shipping, like even USPS gives you a range of at least a couple of days. Just also be careful is that it's especially, I mean, we've certainly seen situations of where a fulfillment center, they might cherry pick their top fastest examples of their shipping data to show that, look, if you want to see like getting to the US in 5 days, we have thousands of tracking numbers that got to the US in 5 days out of like 10,000. So like, yes, it is possible, and I can provide you a lot of information on that, but it's something that you shouldn't base your business around. You shouldn't tell your customers it's going to arrive in 5 days when you fully know, and we fully know, that the range is probably more like 5 to 10 days. That being said, as long as you manage your customer expectations, it's completely fine. Don't promise 2 day shipping. It's not going to be 2 day shipping, right? Even if you have local fulfillment, it's not going to be 2 day shipping anyways, right? There are a lot of ways to manage around it. If you have an actual brand that people want that's differentiated from just buying from Amazon anyways, or just going to their local grocery store, then you can set expectations to say, hey, like this is going to take 7 to 10 days or whatever it might be, and it's totally fine. If you have a customer that is going to buy the same widget on Amazon for maybe cheaper and they have 2 day prime shipping anyways, then you probably that customer is not going to buy from you, and maybe you should rethink why you're competing with Amazon on this exact same product on a 2 day shipping.
So once the parcels then actually arrive, like how does that look like? What is what does the shipping label then look like? Is that like a Chinese label? How does it work?
Yeah, so really, for at least the lines that we recommend, they would actually have a local USPS or just local postal label as well. So to the customer, at least on the surface, it looks exactly the same as any other kind of local fulfilled package. And that's exactly because of the direct injection model. Even though the originating parcels come from China and organized on bulk air freight, when they directly inject into the, let's just say, the USPS system, then actually they require USPS labels or it just wouldn't work. So they would have the label on it. Usually, though, there would be a label underneath that is still not in Chinese, by the way. It will still be in English that actually does indicate that it is from China. In this type of couriers, there is this concept of the first mile tracking or the first mile label versus the last mile tracking or the last mile label. So the last mile is what probably you're more accustomed to. Let's just say USPS or like Royal Mail in the UK, for example. Whatever your local courier that you're used to is, that is the last mile, and that comes with its own tracking number. Using Uniexpress as an example, they also issue a first mile number. It's usually a YT number with a bunch of numbers. And what that does is that gives you all the detailed information when it has left Shenzhen to the next stop, to the warehouse, to Hong Kong, on the plane, et cetera, et cetera. So that has rich, detailed information for your customers, all in English or depending on the country, maybe in their local language, but at least in English. So actually, we have had questions before, or, especially for clients who don't have too much experience shipping parcels directly from China, they want to use the last mile. They think that they want to avoid appearing that it is from China. So my reaction to that is, first of all, you can't physically hide it legitimately. If your customer, if someone wanted to find out that parcel is from China, they'll be able to find it out. It has that last mile information, sure, but then it's also attached to first mile information as well. There's tools that they can find it out, or in many cases, they could just remove the label on the outside and there'll be a China label on the bottom of it. There's actually a lot of downsides also to using a last mile or depending on last mile, because for most shipping lines out there, the last mile, let's say USPS number, always takes a couple of days to generate, which means that it'll be a few days before your customers actually receive the tracking number. And then usually it takes a day or two, sometimes longer, to actually update. So your customers will get the tracking number later, and then they're going to feel like it's just stuck somewhere. So generally, when our clients utilize that method, a lot of times they just swap back to the first mile anyways, because that is not a great experience for your customers. And that's what we always care the most about. And then mostly they'll find that once they swap to the first mile and just obviously it's from China, their customers still don't care. Or even if they care, it doesn't really affect their sales. And at the end of the day, like, that's all that really matters, right? Sure, maybe some customer might grumble about it's from China, but if it doesn't impact your sales, and as a matter of fact, if it fundamentally probably improves your customer experience, or at least mitigates some of the negatives of using that last mile tracking number, then it's probably a wise business decision.
I mean, for the US, it obviously is the last mile tracking label will be USPS, at least majority of the time. There are some last mile labels, for example, for in city dense areas where there'll be more an economic, like a bike delivery, so that the customization of the label is already done in China. In Europe, obviously, every country in Europe has their own postal company, but then still that label will be on there for that last mile in that country. And although the direct injection model doesn't always mean it's injected into each independent country in Europe, there are some hubs that are being used, especially after Brexit, where UK cannot be used anymore for clearance for all over pan-Europe. There are a few injection points that are the main hubs, which therefore also determines the transit time. So Netherlands is one, Belgium is one, France is one. Germany tends to be mainly for Germany. And then you have Eastern Europe, like Budapest. These are very strong injection points. There's some in Southern Europe, but the majority actually is around Liège and Amsterdam and Paris and Budapest. These are main hubs that are being used where the bulk is arriving, it's being custom cleared and then trucked to the last mile. So if you would be, for example, Scandinavia, it will first land in France, then be trucked to Scandinavia and then injected in the last mile. Therefore, it will never be as fast as these 3 to 5 days or 5 to 8 days. It will be a little bit slower, just considering where the injection point is into Europe. The volume and the line haul, there's a limitation of direct flights to some countries. So therefore, you have to optimize somewhere. And that's, I think, something that we have to consider. But either way, no matter where the injection point is, there will be a last mile label on the outside of the parcel so that actually once it arrived in the hub, you don't want handling cost upon arrival in the country of destination. You don't want that because it's too expensive. You want that to be taken care of before it arriving in Europe. That's something is then being taken care of, but there's no confusion. It's if it arrives in Amsterdam and it goes to, let's say, Poland, there will be a last mile label of Poland on it for the Poland Post, but it will not be an issue for the handling itself. All right, but in general, though, the sense of shipping from China, how do consumers look towards that? Do you see that that's an issue at all?
I think, first of all, it is probably going to depend on the country a little bit. I think in the US, there is a little bit more of a real consideration around shipping from China. Although I think even in the US, it's a little bit overstated. And a lot of times it's less about it's shipping literally from China. A lot of times it's more of like customers are going to feel there is a premium in locally made, locally produced, or at least locally shipped kind of product. And that's a very important element that is not exactly the same as there is a general distrust or just dislike of shipping from China. And it's going to depend on your brand. If you're running a store and you sell cheap, questionable quality goods, and your customer has a poor experience and they realize it's from China, then I think there is a very high chance that that customer is going to be unhappy. Blame your brand and blame that it's from China. There are a lot of brands out there that actually ship directly from China, both in terms of Chinese D2C brands, and there's more and more of those these days. There are a lot of like consumer gadget brands and or actually even something like Temu or Shein these days. Like they very clearly ship from China. Temu and Shein, they do sell cheap products, but they sell good value products. They sell a $10 shirt that feels like it's good value for $10. It's not $10 that seems like a $1 shirt, right? So they at least have that cost and value calculation right. But more and more, there's D2C brands, I purchased from a bunch of them that actually are comparable to Western brands and sometimes even better as well. They're based in China. They ship directly from China. They have great customer experiences, and literally no one actually cares because they actually are happy with the product and the experience itself. And that's really what's way more important than whether or not it's shipped from China. And this is more talking about the US. Most locales around the world, they don't care. If you're in Australia, most Australians, they don't somehow think that every brand they purchase from has an Australian warehouse. And most US warehouses don't ship to Australia because it's too expensive anyways, right? So for them, it's totally fine. It's a great product. It ships from China. It's cheaper because of it. It's faster because of it. There are also a lot of regions where it's actually a positive thing that is from China. Actually, Thailand is a market that we're expanding in right now, and just Southeast Asian countries in general. To them, it's a great positive that actually something is from China because they actually perceive that products manufactured in China coming directly from China is of higher quality and higher value than something that is actually shipped locally from Thailand. And again, no one from the US really offers like US to Thailand fulfillment because it's way too expensive, and no one in Thailand is going to want to pay that price premium in order to get like a US fulfilled type of product, and they don't value that at all. And it's fair. You're not going to be able to defend against a direct competitor that is produced in the US and ships in the US. There's so many markets out there that you can't actually access. They don't care about China shipping at all. And then even in the US itself, if you run the brand in the right way, if you have the right messaging, if you have the right expectations, and you still maintain a great customer experience, then our clients who utilize that model, they don't find any issues at all.
Yeah, and regarding that brand experience, I think it's important. Like I ordered something on Temu where were 5 items and I received 5 different parcels. So it's also about how it's being received. So if you're able to consolidate these orders that are being purchased on one store or one platform, and that's a branded experience that they arrive all together as one batch, is very important as well, that we can actually have this consumer experience. So then it's less of an issue that's coming from China because the experience overall is a positive one. Just let me just wrap up with some last tips that I would be able to provide from your side, and then maybe Dayu's last tip. From my side, what I do see when it comes to shipping lines from China is I really recommend to actually include the mobile number of the consumer. It just increases the delivery quality, the delivery ratio. Some countries in the world, the street names aren't always that clear that you actually have to make a phone call to someone to figure out where they are, or when someone is not home. The first time right is very important for a lot of last mile. Some only have one first last mile delivery attempt, and then it's being put in a post office for pickup. So that first time right to get it delivered to the consumer, to be able to register that mobile number, I know that some sellers are against that because it might be sensitive for privacy information. I really recommend it for delivery quality. It's going to be a huge game changer. It's going to be much less questions and higher review rate.
Yeah, I guess one general tip that I want people to take away is there's nothing magic about parcel shipping from China. It's from China. It's not 2-day shipping, but it can be fast enough if you utilize it in the right way. And it should be a complement to your strategy, especially if you're more focusing on local fulfillment. But you got to use it the right way, right? You have to be careful of the nuances of what are the benefits, what are some of the downsides of the watchouts, and be clear to your customers. Maybe it doesn't really matter too much that you literally tell them it's from China, but at least be clear. You know that something's going to take 5 to 10 days. Don't promise 5 days. Say something like 5 to 10 days, or 4 to 7 business days, maybe even better, right? It's totally fine. I've run brands before that have done that. We work with many, many brands who do hundreds, thousands of orders per day in volume that do exactly that, and it's totally fine. Well, actually, anyone who runs a brand knows that customers can be irrational. It is what it is. And customers potentially might say they're not happy that it's from China, but they're going to repurchase again anyways if they actually like the product, if they actually like the experience. So don't worry as much about what you believe or what you think that customers might think about if you're shipping from China, just try it out. And if it works, then it works. And if it drives business, it brings you more customers, if it brings you more loyal customers who then purchase again because of the positive experience, then there's nothing wrong with it. And as a matter of fact, it is and it continues to be an extremely valuable tool set in the clients that we work with in terms of their logistics options.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We actually went step by step on what's happening behind the scene. I really hope you liked it. Please do share and comment on this episode. I really appreciate it if you are able to do that, if you like it. There are not many episodes that actually, or podcasts that know this much of detail, actually being visiting warehouses, talking face to face with the last mile, with the first mile, with everything in between. We really want to give you value, and hopefully you appreciate that and by sharing and liking this episode. Thank you so much, and see you on the next one.